Hello and welcome back for this third session of the 2020 Constitution Week Conference at the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. I'm Scott Paul. I serve here at the center as interim director. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Nick Bunker. Nick is the author of Making Haste from Babylon, the Mayflower Pilgrims and Their World, and An Empire on the Edge, How Britain Came to Fight America, the latter of which won the 2015 George Washington Award and was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2015. Educated at King's College, Cambridge, and Columbia University, Nick worked as a reporter for the Liverpool Echo and the Financial Times. He now lives with his wife, Susan, and their otterhound, champion Teckelgarth Mercury, I hope I got that right, in Lincolnshire, England. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from Nick. Just a reminder, we'll have a time at the end for question and answer. So please submit questions in the comments section on YouTube or email us directly at constitution@uvu.edu. Without further ado, pleased to welcome Nick Bunker.
Right, thank you, Scott. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this conference. I'm delighted, by the way, to be following on from the great Nathaniel Philbrick, a very fine writer, a gentleman, and a scholar. Now, I'm speaking to you today not from my home, which is in the English cathedral city of Lincoln, but from a different location. I'm 250 miles to the north. I'm in the wilds of Scotland, and I've come up here to do some walking in the hills. And if you hear any loud noises off during my talk, that will indeed be my very large and very shaggy dog, Mercury, who always accompanies me on these expeditions into the Scottish wilderness. Now, when Scott and his colleague Andrew Bibby contacted me about this conference, I was delighted to accept the invitation. But I also knew that my contribution would require more than the usual degree of preparation. For a very simple reason, which is this, that it's actually many years since I wrote my book, Making Haste from Babylon. First went on sale more than a decade ago in the spring of 2010. The research for the book was completed earlier still in the summer of 2008. And my intensive period of research had actually commenced 3 years before that in 2005. So it was all quite a long time ago. And so in preparing for today's event, I've had to reread my own work, refresh my memory, and think again about my arguments and about my conclusions and my narrative of the story of the early years of the Plymouth Colony. Now, the task was made a little easier because in 2019, I had to produce a new abridged edition of Making Haste from Babylon for my British publisher to mark the 400th anniversary this year of the voyage of the Mayflower. And this shortened version of the book has recently gone on sale here in the United Kingdom under the title The Mayflower Pilgrims. And you can have it shipped to the USA. You just have to go to www.amazon.co.uk and you can get to it through my author page on www.amazon.com. Now, as I read the book again, as I read Making Haste from Babylon again, first to make the abridgment and then to prepare this talk for today, there was a rather awkward question that was always at the back of my mind, and it was this. If I had the opportunity to begin entirely anew and to rewrite Making Haste from Babylon as a whole in 2020, what would I change? Would it be a different book? Would I wish to revise my interpretation of the early history of the Plymouth Colony and tell the story in a different way? Now, I'm delighted to say that I feel that mostly the book has stood the test of time. But there is one thing that I would change, and it is this. If I were writing the book again today, I would add an extra chapter at the beginning. And I would do that in order to clarify the themes of the book, to give it a sharper focus, and to help the reader on his or her own personal voyage into the 17th century. And this new chapter would be called the long hesitation. And that's where I'm going to begin today, with this concept of the long hesitation. And to help you understand what I mean by that phrase, here are some dates. The first date, very famous, 1492. Christopher Columbus sets sail from Spain, crosses the Atlantic, and reaches the islands that we know today as the Bahamas in the West Indies. The second date, 1519. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés begins the conquest of Mexico, and by 1521, that conquest is substantially complete. 1530, the Portuguese create their first permanent settlement in Brazil, the colony of São Vicente. 1532, Spanish conquest of Peru. 1546, in Bolivia, the Spanish established the great silver mine at Potosi, near Lake Titicaca. Gold they'd already found in Peru and in Mexico, but now, with the opening of the mine at Potosi, the Spanish could begin mining bullion on an industrial scale. So silver and gold begin to flow back to Spain in immense quantities, with huge implications for the politics and the economics of Europe at the time. So by the middle of the 16th century, Spain and Portugal had already built these great empires in the New World. By the 1570s, there were perhaps as many as 120,000 European colonists in Central and South America, almost all of them originating from the Iberian Peninsula or the Mediterranean. Now, while all this was going on, what about the English? Were English settlers and seafarers crossing the Atlantic too? Well, yes, they were, but hesitantly, sporadically, and in far fewer numbers. Now, I'd like to quote one very fine historian from the British Isles, who described the beginnings of English colonization in the Americas as, quote, tardy and tentative, unquote. Now, that quotation comes from the leading authority on the early English voyages across the Atlantic, a man called David Beers Quinn, who died some years ago. He was professor at Liverpool University. And he wrote a wonderful book, a number of wonderful books, the principal one being called England and the Discovery of America, published in 1973. And if you want to delve further into this subject, that's really essential reading. He took the story up, though, just to the eve, if you like, of the voyage of the Mayflower. Didn't go beyond about 1615, but his book is absolutely essential background. Now, what Quinn describes is this slow, tentative process of English settlement and colonization and discovery. Starting in the 1490s, English ships began sailing to the waters off Newfoundland. Off Newfoundland, they found rich sources of cod, the Grand Banks. But as Quinn explains, these were fishing expeditions. What they were doing was they were looking for cod that they could bring back and sell in Spain and Italy and mainly in Southern Europe. They made no attempt, these early English seafarers, to plant settlements on dry ground at any point during the 16th century. And even if they had, Newfoundland is not the mainland of America. It's a long way away. From St. John's, Newfoundland, the distance by sea to Boston, Massachusetts is nearly 1,000 miles. It was only in the 1580s, many decades after the Spanish had already conquered Mexico and Peru and begun to mine for silver in South America, only in the 1580s that we find the English making any attempts to plant colonies in the New World to rival those of Portugal or Spain. And these attempts were a pretty sorry failure. Starting in 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored 3 expeditions to what is now North Carolina. Off the coast of North Carolina, on the island of Roanoke, they landed 108 settlers who built a fort and a village, tried to farm the land, tried to build a relationship with the native people whom they encountered. By the end of the 1580s, this little colony at Roanoke had vanished and its fate remains a mystery. Not until 1607, nearly a century after Cortés arrived in Mexico, did the Virginia Company of London finally succeed in establishing a permanent settlement in North America, the Jamestown colony. And even then, the capital committed to the venture was modest. For 15 years or more, under-resourced, unprofitable, beset by disease, the Jamestown colonies struggled to survive. Even in 1620, the population at Jamestown still numbered fewer than 1,000, or to be precise, 982. The number of people recorded in a census taken in that year, and including the 20 African slaves brought into the James River on a Dutch ship in 1619. So, in stark contrast to the much faster and more decisive Spanish imperialism of the 16th century, the early English efforts at discovery and colonization in America were, as I said, slow, sporadic, only modestly successful. And that's what I mean by the long hesitation. In the New World, the English were laggards and latecomers who took a very long time to make up their minds to embark on a serious commitment to transatlantic settlement. The trouble is, this raises two very big questions. First question, why? What were the factors at work, whether they were social or economic or political or ideological, that kept the English away from the American mainland for so long? And secondly, given that there was such a long hesitation, and if there were good reasons why it occurred, which there were, then why did the situation change so suddenly and so radically after 1620? Because in the 1620s and the 1630s, we finally see a drastic acceleration in the pace of English activity in the Atlantic. The voyage of the Mayflower was simply the first step in this process of acceleration, and it would be followed by two more. 1627, very important date, the English colonization of Barbados in the West Indies. And then 1629 and 1630, the foundation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, centered on the town of Boston, Massachusetts. As the 1630s unfolded, this process of acceleration continued. The new colonies grew rapidly, absorbing wave after wave of new migrants from the British Isles. They traded with each other, with the mother country, with continental Europe, and with the earlier colony in Virginia, exchanging ships and people and commodities. So that by 1640, there had come into being a new pattern of transatlantic relationships between England, colonies in North America, the West Indies, and continental Europe. A new pattern of relations that would profoundly transform the history of the Western Hemisphere. So in effect, by 1640, what you had in these new colonies was, at least in embryo, the British imperial system that would endure until the American Revolution of the 1770s. This is an imperial system, of course, that would contain as a core component the institution of slavery. And later, when I finish, one question you might want to ask me about is the relationship between the Plymouth Colony and the early history of slavery in North America. Now, let's try to answer the question I posed a little earlier. Why was it only now, in the 1620s, that English merchants and mariners and migrants, like the Mayflower Pilgrims, saw the need for a venture such as the voyage of the Mayflower? Well, in a word, incentives, or rather the lack of incentives. The fact of the matter is that prior to 1620 or so, there had been no urgent incentive, no pressing need for projects such as this. As the Roanoke and the Virginia episodes had shown, colonization was a risky, dangerous, and expensive business. And prior to 1620 or thereabouts, the ratio between risk and reward looked decidedly unattractive. Now, we might just want to think for a moment about the condition of England in the early 17th century, which is, as it happens, the age of Shakespeare. Was Shakespeare's England a country that felt that it required colonies? Was it a country where there were people who were likely to feel impelled or compelled to emigrate to a new land? And the answer is, for the most part, no, in the very early 1600s. You see, from a political point of view, Shakespeare's England actually enjoyed, by the standards of the era, a better than average degree of peace and quiet and stability, especially compared, for example, to France. If you look at France, it was a much more unstable country circa 1600 than England. Now, in England, there were occasional plots. There was the occasional attempt at a coup d'etat. But the last serious popular rebellion had been more than 30 years earlier, in 1569 to 70, an incident called the Northern Rising, and that had been crushed pretty rapidly. Now, in Shakespeare's period, there was a new king on the throne, James I. He arrived on the throne in 1603. And since James I was also James I, King of Scotland, the northern border of England was safe and secure because the two countries were on the way to unification. Now, there were two wars underway, one against the Spanish and the other against rebels in Ireland. But those wars were in their closing stages. Both ended early in the reign of King James I. And so the Kingdom of England was left peaceful, tolerably quiet, and mostly subject to the rule of law. It wasn't therefore a place of such great disorder at that point in the early 1600s that large numbers of people would feel compelled to go and quit the shores of England to go elsewhere. Now, what about the economic condition of England? Now, this is an important matter. It's complex, but the gist of it is this. England suffered from one chronic problem, which was the poor productivity of its agriculture. In the 1590s, there were several years of very poor harvests. Indeed, parts of the country came close to famine. Now, for decades, the standard of living of the labouring poor, in other words, most of the population of England at the time, had been getting worse and worse and worse. The number of people in England had risen from about 3 million in 1560 to more than 4 million in 1600. But the food supply had failed to increase at the same rate. Prices had also risen steeply, but faster than wages, and so the labouring poor grew ever poorer. Their living standards probably reached their lowest ebb in about 1610. However, as yet, there was no urgent need for emigration to North America, and no urgent need for investors, business people, entrepreneurs to look for opportunities on the far side of the Atlantic. Because in the early 1600s, there were too many safer or more lucrative opportunities at home in England or in other locations overseas. For example, let's say you wish to emigrate. You would not sail 3,000 miles to North America when instead you could simply cross the Irish Sea. It's a very important point that the first English colonies were their colonies in Ireland. If you had met a 17th century Londoner and asked him, please name an English plantation, he might mention Jamestown, Virginia, he might, but he would be far more likely to mention the two English plantations in Ireland, the Munster plantation, which was founded in 1586, and the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland, which was founded in 1606. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that the wars the English were fighting in Ireland, but those wars were ending. In 1607, a very important date in Irish history, the English drove the last of the great Irish rebel leaders into exile in an incident known as the Flight of the Earls. And then the Ulster plantation began to grow rapidly. And so that, not North America, was the obvious first choice of a destination for anyone who wished to emigrate. Now, let's imagine you simply wanted to make money. You were a Londoner who wanted to make money in the early 1600s. What did you buy? Well, you didn't think about investing in America. Instead, you bought real estate at home in the mother country. And chiefly you bought farmland because rents and the price of land in England were on the up and up. For the reasons I mentioned, essentially that prices were going up faster than wages. Not until the 1620s, an important date, did the price of farmland in England begin to level off and even decline a little bit. Until that point, farmland was the investment of choice. Now, let's imagine that you wish to invest in overseas trade. Well, your first choice would be a traditional one, textiles, woolen cloth. Woolen cloth woven on English looms and then exported to France or Flanders or the Dutch Republic. Since the 15th century, this had been England's primary export business. And if you wanted to make money by importing products, you would import wine. Import wine from France, Spain, or Italy. In the early 17th century, the wine trade between London and the continent was booming as never before. And this has a very direct relevance to the Mayflower, the ship and her master, Christopher Jones. The Mayflower was based in London at the heart of the wine trade. Before she went to America in 1620, the Mayflower and her master, Mr. Jones, had developed a kind of peaceful routine of regular voyages between England and Europe. They would load up in London or in Southampton with cargoes of English woolen cloth. They would sail to the French ports of Bordeaux and La Rochelle, or the Spanish harbours of Alicante and Cadiz and so on, and they would come home filled with wine and sherry and French brandy and so on. That was what they did. That was what merchant ships of her class tended to do. Didn't think about America. And finally, what if you were a very adventurous but wealthy, well-connected merchant in London, well established among the commercial elite? Well, again, you wouldn't look to America. You would look to the most exclusive new opportunity of all, the best new opportunity of all. You would seek to become a shareholder of the English East India Company. Founded in 1600, specializing in luxury goods, the East India Company, which sent its ships on trading voyages to Asia in pursuit of silk and cottons and spices, which could be sold at home at a very large and attractive profit. So, to summarize, in the early 1600s, although English seafarers had gradually acquired some expertise in sailing to American waters, there was still no pressing, urgent need for a decisive push westwards across the Atlantic. The incentives just weren't there. There were too many other options for emigration or trade, and those options were safer and more attractive than an arduous journey into an unknown American landscape. But all of this was going to change. In the 1620s, a new set of circumstances came into being, a new configuration of forces, if you will. And in this new environment, the colonies in New England also came into existence, with the Plymouth Colony, home of the Mayflower settlers, as the prototype. The Plymouth Colony as the prototype. And that's a very important concept to get across, which is that the Plymouth Colony became the model or the prototype for a certain type of colony that could survive on the coast of North America. Now, what was this new set of circumstances which came into being in the 1620s? Well, it had four principal components. And in my book, Making Haste from Babylon, I try to describe these four components and to show how they fitted together. First of all, in order to have a venture like the Mayflower voyage, you had to have a group of people, a disaffected or discontented minority whose other options had all run out. A group of highly motivated people for whom the voyage to America became not just an option, but a necessity. And these people were the core group of radical Puritans or separatists who sailed on the Mayflower and became the leaders of the Plymouth Colony. Most notable among them being the future governor of New Plymouth, William Bradford. Secondly, the second component. In 1618 and 1619, the course of events in Western Europe, including England, took a turn for the worse, both politically and economically. Indeed, to many observers at the time, including William Bradford and his comrades, events appeared to be taking a catastrophic turn for the worse, with North America offering the only viable escape route. However, and this is the third point, the third component, there was also a new commercial opportunity which beckoned from across the ocean. Now, this commercial opportunity mostly had to do with an essential element in my narrative, an essential element in my book, the North American fur trade, and more specifically, the trade in beaver skins. Without the North American beaver, and without the trade in beaver fur, the New England colonies simply could not have survived. They would have given up and gone back to England within their first 10 years of existence. And finally, component number 4, in the 1620s and the 1630s, at last the English possessed the maritime resources that they required if they were to occupy the northeastern seaboard of what is now the United States. And so I'm talking here about what you might call the logistics of colonization. To transport settlers from Europe to America in sufficient quantities, the quantities required for lasting success, you needed ships, you needed large ships, you needed experienced seafarers, you needed advanced navigational skills, and you needed regular reinforcements by way of supply ships that could be sent out year after year to replace those settlers who had failed to survive, and to keep the fledgling colonies equipped with everything they needed. Good example, arms and ammunition. There was no lead, no gunpowder available in North America. Right up until the revolution in the 1770s, this was an issue in America, the shortage of gunpowder and lead. Had to come from England, had to be sent on ships to reinforce the early colonies. It was only in about 1630 that the resources of England's mercantile marine, a fleet of merchant ships, achieved the size, the critical mass that was necessary to build a kind of colonial network in the Americas. Now, in the second half of this talk today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little more detail about each of these four core components of the story. I'd like to start with the people whom I referred to a moment ago as a disaffected or discontented minority. In other words, the Mayflower Pilgrims. Who were they? Why were they discontented? And in search of answers to those questions, we have to delve quite deeply into the social history of England at the time. And this is one of the things I did in my book, Making Haste from Babylon. In one section of the book, I looked very closely at the origins, the domestic English environment, if you like, of two of the Mayflower passengers, Governor William Bradford, who I mentioned earlier, and his close friend and mentor, an older man, William Brewster. Now, William Bradford and William Brewster, the leaders of the Plymouth Colony, originated in a very specific geographical location, about 150 miles north of London, in an area where three counties met, the counties of Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, and Yorkshire. Through this area ran two major lines of communication. One was a road, the Great North Road, which was the main highway between London and Scotland. William Brewster lived by the side of the road at a village in Nottinghamshire called Scrooby, where he was a member of the local gentry. Not a rich man, but he qualified as a gentleman, partly because he was a graduate of Cambridge University. He also had an official function. He was the royal postmaster, meaning that Brewster supervised the mail station at Scrooby, responsible for relaying official messages up and down the highway. The other line of communication in the area was a river, the River Trent. The River Trent, which flowed down into the North Sea past a great seaport, the seaport of Hull, from which ships would sail to Germany, Scandinavia, the Dutch Republic. Near the home of William Brewster at Scrooby, there was also a smaller river called the Idle, which connected with the Trent. And so we can call this area the Trent Idle Valley. Now, earlier on, I tried to describe for you the basic outlines of the economics and the social profile of England in the age of Shakespeare, very briefly. Now, I portrayed England as quite a peaceful, reasonably orderly place, but there were some exceptions to the rule. And this was true of the Trent Idle Valley. This area was not peaceful and not especially orderly. It was actually a region of division and conflict. And in this rather turbulent location, we can see forces at work that would drive a minority of people into exile and emigration. Now, I'm just going to digress just a little bit to give you some essential historical background. Since the Norman conquest of 1066, or even before, England had been a unified kingdom. But the old feudal system of the Middle Ages had left behind a legacy of what some historians call a cellular system of local government. In other words, England, the unified kingdom, was made up of lots of cells or pockets or enclaves. And each of these cells had its own local history and its own local customs and traditions. Now, in the early 17th century, the basic cellular building block of English government and society was the parish. There were about 9,000 parishes. Each parish had a parish church and a parish minister ordained by the Protestant Church of England. The average population of a parish was probably about 500 people. And very important point, it was legally compulsory for everyone above the age of 16 to attend Sunday service at the parish church. The parishes were grouped into larger units of maybe a dozen parishes or so, with a market town at the centre of the group. These units were known as hundreds. In their turn, the hundreds were grouped into larger units known as counties, average population about 80,000. And the parishes and the hundreds and the counties were units of government, social organisation, and also they were religious units as well. Now, much of the time, this cellular system of government, based on the parish and the county, did what the King of England required. It kept the peace, it levied taxes, and in time of war, it raised the militia, the county militia. And crucially for our story today, the English parish structure was also designed to maintain religious obedience, which mostly it did. However, occasionally, in certain parts of the country, this English system of cellular government became seriously dysfunctional. There were local rivalries, there were local conflicts over land and water and status, and local incidents of disobedience to royal authority. And this was true of the area where William Bradford and William Brewster originated, the Trent Idle Valley. The Trent Idle Valley and the county of Nottinghamshire surrounding it had a bad reputation as a disorderly region, beset by feuds and vendettas between the leading families of landowners. There was also a religious divide. You see, officially, England was supposed to be an entirely Protestant nation, as it had been since King Henry VIII broke away from Rome in the 1530s. But the English Reformation was a long and untidy process, and in the early 1600s, there still remained a substantial Roman Catholic minority, a Catholic resistance, if you will. And this Catholic resistance tended to be strongest in the remoter parts of the kingdom, such as Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire, 150 miles from London. And this was worrisome, in this case, to the royal authorities, Catholics in this region, but there were also, at the opposite end of the religious spectrum, there were the Puritans. And I'm sure you've heard something about this already today, but the Puritan movement had come into existence in the 1560s. It was made up of sincere radical Protestants, men and women committed to a thorough reformation of the Church of England, a reformation which would, they hoped, cleanse the church of the last lingering vestiges of Catholic influence. Now, as it happens, the Puritan movement had actually put down deep roots in the area I'm talking about, the Brewster Bradford area, the Trent Idle Valley. In the 1570s and 1580s, because this area was strategically important, the authorities had actually encouraged Puritan activity as a bulwark against the renegade Catholics. For many years, the authorities continued to allow Puritanism to flourish in this area, even though technically Puritans were in breach of the official regulations of the Church of England. Now, for the full story of what happened next, I would have to refer you to my book, to Making Haste from Babylon. But the gist of it is this, that by about 1603, there existed a local network of Puritans, including Postmaster William Brewster and his young friend and protege William Bradford. And they did have some influential friends. They enjoyed a degree of protection from the local magistrates, the justices of the peace in the county. And the Puritan network in the idle Trent Valley also included local clergymen, preachers, evangelists, who served as parish ministers in 4 parishes in the area. Now, starting in 1605, the new King James I began a nationwide purge of the Puritan movement, whom he saw as troublemakers, stirrers up of unrest, and potential rebels against the crown. In 1605 and the following year, 1606, the authorities cracked down hard on Puritan clergymen, and nationwide they fired about 60 of them from their posts as parish ministers, including the 4 Puritan ministers in the Trent Idle Valley, friends of William Brewster, and all 4 were dismissed. Now, the situation was all the more tense and fraught and bad-tempered because of the local politics. Now, the richest, most powerful landowner in the area was the Earl of Shrewsbury. He was loyal to the crown, keen to squash any signs of unrest or disaffection. But he was also, as it happens, a man with Catholic connections. His wife, the Countess of Shrewsbury, was suspected of being a secret Roman Catholic. The Earl of Shrewsbury, as I say, was the most powerful man in the area, but he had a rival, another local aristocrat called Lord Sheffield, who was the senior royal official in the north of England. But just to make things more complicated, he had also married a Roman Catholic lady, and yet Sheffield himself had Puritan sympathies. So it was a complicated little situation here. But the gist of it was that the 2 men, the Earl of Shrewsbury and Lord Sheffield, competed and squabbled with each other for dominance of the region. Now, the situation became still more complicated in 1607, when James I appointed a new Archbishop of York. Now, the new Archbishop was under strict instructions to stamp out any religious dissent in his province. And so he began another purge, this time directed against both Catholics and Puritans. Scores of Catholics were arrested. They were locked up in the jail at York Castle. But there were also arrests of Puritans too. Meanwhile, the 2 rival aristocrats, the Earl of Shrewsbury and Lord Sheffield, were both determined to retain the support of King James, and so they lent their support to this new campaign against religious dissent. And caught up in the middle of all this were the Puritans of the Trent Idle Valley, with among them William Brewster and the young William Bradford. To cut a long story short, in the spring of 1607, William Brewster and his fellow Puritans committed a rare and radical act of disobedience. They left the official established Church of England and they formed their own independent Christian assemblies, which was against the law. In doing this, they became what were known as separatists. Now, they weren't the first people to do this. There had already been notorious incidents of separatism elsewhere in England in the 1580s and 1590s, but it was still a very bold and unusual thing to do. And with all the local authorities ranged against them, they were left with little option but to look for a place of exile. And it was this which led in 1600 to their departure from England. And now, as I'm sure you know, they didn't immediately go to North America. Not yet. Instead, the separatists of the Trent Idle Valley, numbering about 100 men, women, and children, went into exile in the Netherlands. They settled first in Amsterdam, and then in the Dutch industrial city of Leiden, a place where they could earn a living in the textile trade. Now, as you will have understood by now, this story is pretty complicated, but there's one key point I hope you will take away from what I've just said, which has to do with motivation. The early experience of colonization in New England was arduous, it was very arduous, so arduous that only highly motivated people were going to survive. And that's why in examining the careers of the early colonists, we have to delve into the local details of their English origins, because it's in the local details of time and place and circumstance and personality that you'll find the sources of the motivation. And I think you're going to be hearing from Caleb Johnson in a little while, who I think will be talking more about the origins of some of the Mayflower passengers, and I think he will be bringing out some of these points too, because it does require a lot of pretty detailed work on the detailed origins of these individuals. But now we have to fast forward 10 years to 1618, 10 years after the separatists left the Trent Idle Valley. 1618, a year of profound crisis in Western Europe. This was the year that witnessed the outbreak of the long and bloody series of conflicts that have come to be known as the 30 Years' War. A sectarian war waged between Catholic and Protestant powers. On one side, the Catholic powers of Spain and Habsburg Austria. On the other, the Protestant principalities of Germany, the Dutch Republic, and in due course, the Kingdom of Sweden as well. Now, in two different ways, the international crisis of 1618 helped to bring about the voyage of the Mayflower. First point was there was a clear and present danger that the place of exile of the English separatists, the Dutch city of Leiden, would be engulfed by the hostilities. Spain had an army in the southern Netherlands, only 80 miles from Leiden, poised and ready, it was thought, to attack the Dutch. Brewster and Bradford already had some good reasons to consider leaving Leiden because it was an overcrowded town, squalid, ridden with disease, and the textile industry in which the Pilgrims worked was tough, debilitating. If and when war broke out, Leiden would become intolerable. And so they began to reach out to Puritan contacts in London who might be able to help them plan and finance their voyage across the Atlantic. Second point was this. The onset of the 30 Years' War had brought with it an economic depression, which spilled over into England. And a little earlier, I gave you a brief overview of the English economy as it functioned. And it was quite a fragile economy, far too dependent upon the export of woolen textiles. 1620, the export trade in textiles collapsed because of the depression in Europe. The merchants of London were in difficulties. They were looking for alternatives which might be found in North America. Meanwhile, the Virginia Company, the owners of Jamestown, were also in dire need of reinforcements for that colony. And here we have to talk about a gentleman by the name of Sir John Wolstenholme. He's talked about in my book. He was a London merchant. He was a shareholder in the East India Company and the Virginia Company. He was also a man fascinated by mathematics, astronomy, the science of navigation. He was involved, for example, in helping to finance English voyages of exploration in search of a northwest passage to India and China by way of the Canadian Arctic. Wolstenholme, Sir John Wolstenholme and his associates were keen to ensure that English settlers would occupy what they called the northern parts of Virginia, by which they meant the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley, because these they thought were strategically essential locations which might help to open up the Northwest Passage. So between 1618 and 1620, there gradually occurred a meeting of mind between three groups of people. The separatists in Leiden, seeking a new place of refuge, led by William Brewster and Bradford and their colleagues. Sir John Wolstenholme and his circle, who were eager to strengthen England's foothold in America, and so who helped them secure royal permission to go to America. And finally, a consortium of investors, about 70 investors based in London, mostly youngish men at a relatively early stage in their careers, were prepared to take the risk of financing the voyage. Not only that, but amongst these 70 investors, there were some men who were quite keen Puritans themselves. They were not separatists, but they were at least sympathetic towards the concept of an evangelical Christian colony in the New World. And in Making Haste from Babylon, I give you profiles of two of these investors, these London investors, which help to explain where they were coming from. A lot of their motivation arose from a new commercial opportunity. In other words, the beaver fur trade that I referred to earlier. This really was the key to the success of the Plymouth Colony, the beaver fur trade. Now, what was it all about? Well, some 40 years earlier, in the 1580s, a new type of luxury product had been invented in France, the beaver hat, an expensive, exclusive product made from felt, created by a long and highly skilled process from the fur of the beaver. Now, the problem they had was that in Western Europe, the beaver had been hunted to extinction long ago. So the only sources available were either in Russia, meaning Siberia, or in North America. And this again is a very important point, that the English move westwards to colonize North America took place in parallel with the Russian expansion eastwards across the Urals into Siberia. Both processes unfolded at the same time, in the same century. And I explain the connections between them in my book, in Making Haste from Babylon, because the idea, what I'm trying to do there is to place the voyage of the Mayflower in its global, worldwide setting. Now, until 1620 or so, the hat makers and the beaver hat wearers of England relied on beaver skins sourced from Siberia. These skins could only be acquired by the English by means of a long, hazardous voyage up through the Arctic Circle to the Russian seaport of Archangel. However, the Russian fur trade was a monopoly, 100% controlled by the Tsarist regime in Moscow. And the Tsars demanded a very high price for the furs that they would sell in Archangel. And the price had to be paid in hard currency, silver or gold. Hence the commercial incentive in 1620 for London merchants to try to open up safer, cheaper sources of beaver skins in what is now the northeastern United States. And this was another reason why, when the Mayflower Pilgrims planned the voyage, their initial aim was not to land in Massachusetts, but to go to the Hudson River, near New York, because the river would offer an excellent means of access deep into the interior to trade with native people for beaver skins. And Brewster and Bradford knew that Dutch settlers were already trying to do that. They were trying to occupy the mouth of the Hudson River for that very reason, to get the beaver skins. Now, what I've done in the course of the last 40 minutes, I've tried to give you what I hope is a clearer idea of the wider historical context of the voyage of the Mayflower and of the early history of the Plymouth Colony. And what I'd like to leave you with is this, that from the point of view of the settlers themselves, and from the point of view of their financial backers in London, the Plymouth Colony actually turned out to be quite a remarkable success. It took 8 years altogether, but by the end of 1628, the Plymouth Colony had done what it meant to do. It had secured its future on the North American mainland. And it had developed, as I said earlier, the prototype, the model or the formula for much larger colonies that would follow. The formula being a colony which was financed by profits from the beaver fur trade. The trade in beaver skins serviced the colony's borrowings in London and paid a dividend to the investors back home. It was a colony that could feed itself by devising a form of agriculture based on a blend of North American maize and bean farming and English livestock husbandry, because they did bring livestock over. Towards the end of the 1620s, they actually were bringing over cows and pigs and so on. Supplemented, of course, by the hunting and gathering they could do. The Plymouth Colony was also a colony that could govern itself. They took elements of the old English parish and county structures that I mentioned earlier, and then they adapted them in the New World to add much more of a way of democracy. And that's part of the significance of the Mayflower Compact. And there's a section of my book which focuses very clearly on the Mayflower Compact, the wording of the Mayflower Compact and its sources in England. And finally, it was a colony that enjoyed a relatively high degree of morale and motivation and cohesion arising from what it saw as its evangelical mission. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the Plymouth Colony, the prototype. And now I'll try to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was fascinating. As is evidenced by the questions that have been flowing in as you've been speaking.
Oh, good.
I wonder if I could pick one of the questions that follows up on what you've been speaking on most recently, and just, this is a student question. Were there some common factors that determined if a colony succeeded or failed? Of course, you've talked about what's worked in Plymouth, but was it scalable?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, the best way to get at this is to look at the French colonies. Because remember that it was a French colonist, Champlain, who came from La Rochelle in the southwest of France. And he had been the great leader of a series of expeditions by the French to what is now Nova Scotia and then to Quebec. And he kept very good records and wrote very good narratives, which really explain in some detail about how the experience of his colonies. And yes, it was a question of scale was important. The availability of supply ships, you had to be sure that there were going to be supply ships would come over and bring you what you needed regularly. So you had to have scale, you had to have supply ships, you had to have a product, because the beaver fur trade was actually the essential product that gave you the wherewithal to pay the investors in London or in Paris, or in his case, or in La Rochelle in his case, who were going to keep on sending the supply ships over. That was essential too. But also there was the issue of morale. And Champlain ran up against exactly the same problem, that keeping people going through these very harsh winters was really very difficult indeed. You needed to build their morale. Now, the difference between the French colonies and the English colonies was that the English colonies had a heavy religious component. The French colonies, not so much. They were mostly Catholics, and in due course, they did send over Jesuit fathers who came over to join the colonies. But in the early days, they weren't really religious colonies at all. And so Champlain found other means of building morale and keeping morale going. I mean, he would organize things like, for example, he would organize amateur dramatics. the French actually had an amateur theatre company which they set up, and they would stage plays for each other on the coast of America as a way of keeping themselves cheerful. They being French, of course, they did bring quite a lot of wine with them, and so again they would have these. They would ration out their supplies and eke out their provisions, but they would nevertheless do something, and they would use the French skills of cuisine and so forth to try and make life palatable in the new world. So Champlain was very well aware of this issue about morale. And you can see the same things in the English colonies, that you needed all these different elements: scale, motivation, you needed the product, the beaver skins, and you needed secure supporters at home. But mostly, a lot of this was arrived at, this formula, by a process of painful trial and error. Because prior to the Mayflower voyage, there had been a number of English expeditions to the coast of New England, particularly to Maine, which had not gone well at all. There'd been one particularly disastrous one in about 1609.
Okay. Another student question following up on that one. It could go to morale. So why were English colonies, which had entire families in their colonies, so much different than Spanish colonies that seemed to be more militaristic, which was more successful?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, from a military point of view, you see, England didn't really have a permanent military. The English, in wartime, what would happen in England is that they would simply gather the county militias together to form an army. And the Navy would mostly consist of ships that actually were merchant ships, commercial ships. And much of the English war effort at sea at this period was actually what we call privateering. In other words, private merchant vessels who were given a license by the Crown to go out and hunt for French or Dutch or Spanish ships around the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or the English Channel. So the English didn't really have a kind of permanent military establishment at this particular period. That came much later. So that's one reason for that. With regard to the question of families, well, that does always seem to have been the English pattern from the very beginning. I find that a bit curious, actually. Some of the earliest colonies were all male, and indeed the Plymouth colony actually did have a very high balance of males to females for much of its early 10 years. But nevertheless, the intention was always there to take over family groups. It's an interesting question, a very interesting question. I think much of it may arise simply from the way that's the way English society was organized, that English people saw themselves as being part of households. The fundamental unit of English society was the household, and maybe five members to it. And that was just the way it worked.
Okay. Moving a bit to economics. So a question from one of our teacher partners here at the center. Did competition with the Dutch impact motivation? And was the Mayflower originally headed for modern day Manhattan?
Yes, it was originally headed for the Hudson River. Whether it would have been Manhattan or not, I'm not sure. My suspicion is they would actually have landed on Staten Island. Staten Island would have made an extremely good location for an early colony, because if you look at the map of Staten Island, if you know it at all, around the back of Staten Island, there's kind of sheltered waterway, and there's a river there. I think it's the Raritan River. I think that would have made a certain amount of sense. So what was the rest of the question? I forgot the rest of the question.
Did the competition with the Dutch impact motivation?
Oh yeah, well, but it certainly helped. The big breakthrough, though, for the Plymouth colony in terms of the beaver trade, came in the second half of the 1620s, when England went to war with France and Spain. Now, when England went to war with France and Spain in 1625, and this war dragged on for several years, the effect of that was to dramatically increase the price that beaver skins would fetch in the London market. There was a huge increase in the price of beaver skins from about 1626, 1627 onwards. And because the prices went up, the profits went up. And so the opportunity for the pilgrims at that stage was really excellent. They could get extremely good price for the product. And by that time, they had opened up these commercial sources of beaver fur in Maine, up the Kennebec River in Maine. They were, however, competing with the Dutch. Now, what seems to have happened at that particular point is that, if you like, the Dutch colonists and the Plymouth colonists appear to have more or less agreed that they would have kind of different spheres within which they would operate. The English went up to Maine and the Dutch went up the Hudson River. There seems to be kind of a gentleman's agreement, if you like, that they would divide up the territory between them. Later on, of course, that didn't occur. Later on, of course, the English and the Dutch fought wars with each other from the 1650s onwards, part of which were motivated by the desire to exclude each other from the North American coast.
Okay. Now I see a trend here towards English history. So first, a question in that vein. what effect would the Clarendon codes have had on effective governance in disorderly counties or with rebellious hundreds or parishes?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question, because my most recent book, called Young Benjamin Franklin, does deal with the issue of the Clarendon Codes. It deals with precisely that point. The Clarendon Codes being the laws introduced early in the reign of Charles II in the 1660s, which effectively outlawed anything resembling separatism. It outlawed any private religious gatherings. It aimed to kind of establish it aimed to re-establish the Church of England's complete authority over religious observance in England. And in Young Benjamin Franklin, what I do is explore how that actually functioned in one particular part of England. The point is that Benjamin Franklin's father, Josiah Franklin, was indeed a religious refugee, an exile from England, who left England in 1683 to escape from the Clarendon Codes and their successors. So it did have a great impact. The amount of emigration to America during the 1680s, driven by the 1670s and 80s, driven by the Clarendon Code, was relatively modest. But in a way, that was because I think it wasn't a hopeless situation, because Parliament was continually resisting the Clarendon Code. And there were a series of crises beginning in the 1670s, which eventually ended up with the expulsion of James II and the Glorious Revolution of 1688-9. So eventually the way that problem was resolved was through the action of Parliament in the 1680s. But yeah, the Clarendon Code in the 1660s, it had a very important impact. Actually, of course, the most dramatic impact of the Clarendon Code and the other piece of legislation over religion introduced by Charles II were in the place where I'm sitting now. I mean, I'm actually in Upper Tweeddale, south of Edinburgh, 30 miles south of Edinburgh. This area that I'm sitting in now was one of the strongholds of the Presbyterian Covenanters in the 1670s and 1680s. And in this very valley where I am sitting, took place some of the executions by a firing squad of Covenanters by the forces of the Crown, just along the valley here.
Okay. Another student question, delving a little deeper on this issue, I think. What would be the consequences of religious disobedience imposed upon the parishes, and were individuals along with parish leaders sanctioned as a result?
Yeah, there were. Essentially, the way it worked was this. If you failed to turn up for church on a Sunday, and as you were supposed to do, it was not a tremendously serious offence. It was dealt with by the church authorities, by the local archdeacon's court. And there was a small fine for a first offence. But of course, if you continually failed to turn up, then the fines would increase and increase, and eventually you could actually be imprisoned. Much more serious, and the real problem for the Puritans was the threat of being prosecuted for sedition. If you simply fail to attend church, as I say, relatively modest offence, if your actions could be interpreted as sedition, then that was a felony, which in theory was punishable by death. Separation from the Church of England, which is what the Mayflower passages, was also a felony, and effectively the punishment for that, oddly enough, was actually expulsion from England, which of course is what they did. They expelled themselves from England, in fact. So the penalties could be quite severe. It has to be said, though, that the separatists, the Pilgrims, were never treated as harshly as the Roman Catholics were. The Catholics in the North of England were treated much more severely, and there were many more instances of executions of Catholics. In fact, as far as I know, James I never, ever executed a Puritan, but he executed an awful lot of Roman Catholics.
Okay. Another student question says, I've always been curious as to how the separatists secured the approval of the British Crown for a deed in America. If the Crown was trying to stamp them out, why would they allow them to build a foundation for future colonies?
Well, I think the reason was that the great efforts that the Crown have been making to eradicate separatism or Puritanism and separatism in the early 1600s had been successful. And by the time you get to 1618, 1619, 1620, James I believed that he had effectively achieved what he had set out to do. He'd effectively destroyed Puritanism as a real danger to the realm. And so he could afford to be a little bit lenient. Also, of course, you see at this particular period, he was, one of his most important aspects of his foreign policy was his alliance with the Netherlands. And his alliance with the Netherlands basically meant that he was prepared to, because the Netherlands was essentially a Calvinist country, and they didn't have an established church in the Dutch Republic, but essentially it was a Calvinist country. Because of that, he was prepared to tolerate the kind of religious practices that were commonplace in the Netherlands. But the main reason, as I say, was simply the fact that he believed he'd won. He didn't really see them as a threat. And certainly not if they were 3,000 miles away across the other side of the Atlantic.
Interesting. Now, we do have a student who took you up on your suggestion. Who said, I would be interested in your elaboration on Plymouth and the history of slavery in North America.
Well, here it's a question of what I talked about in the course of the talk was that the pattern of trading relationships that came into existence in the 1620s and 1630s. In their initial, in the first 10 or so years of the Plymouth Colony, then the issue of slavery is not really germane, because the Pilgrims essentially were trying to create a relatively small, relatively self-contained farming, fishing and trading based colony, which was going to be, as I say, self-contained. It did enter into trading relations. Those trading relations were pretty specialized. They're specializing on the beaver fur trade. As time went by, however, pretty early on, from the early 1630s, they began to build commercial relations also with the West Indies. And this is really the important point. From about 1631 onwards, it's possible to find, by tracing the maritime records, that it was becoming commonplace, it was becoming standard practice for English sea captains to sail from England to the West Indies, then from the West Indies up to Massachusetts, and then back to England. This was not the same as the famous triangular trade of the 18th century, but it had some things in common with it. Effectively, they had found that they could make, commercially, the most viable thing for them to do would be to link these three locations together. And the really key event here was the colonization by the English of Barbados in 1627. It's really Barbados that is actually the center of the story in terms of the early period of the English in the West Indies and their involvement in slavery. Barbados settled in 1627. By the early 1630s, Barbados was producing tobacco. And what was happening was that because they wanted to colonize, to specialize in the production of a cash crop, i.e. tobacco, the settlers on Barbados did not want to grow food on Barbados itself. They preferred to actually get their provisions, whether it be corn or meat or whatever, from New England or from the mainland, and specialize on Barbados itself in terms of growing a cash crop. Therefore, the provision, what was known as the provisioning trade, grew up between the West Indies and New England colonies. Then the next big event, of course, is 1640, which is roughly 1640, which is when sugar was introduced into Barbados. And Barbados began to produce sugar and rum, molasses, and so forth. And also, of course, about that point, slave labor was also introduced into Barbados. Now, given the trading relationships that already existed, that had been built up in the early 1630s between New England and the West Indies, by the 1640s, you've got pretty much in embryo, you have what remained the case throughout the 18th century as well, whereby New England, Pennsylvania, the mainland colonies acted as the sources of provisioning for the slave colonies, for the slave economy of the West Indies and South. And in addition to that, of course, they remained the recipients. They became the principal recipients instead of customers for the rum, the molasses, the sugar, the molasses, and the rum that came from the West Indies. So the kind of trading system of the Atlantic economy which the English created, which became so large and so dominant in the 18th century, in the period when slavery was at its peak in the English colonies, it had actually been created pretty early on. And the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts colony fairly early on became part of that system. Of course, the most striking example of connection between the Plymouth colony and slavery is the very personal connection involving Edward Winslow. And I think you would have heard something about Edward Winslow possibly already this morning. Edward Winslow, who was one of the leaders of the Plymouth colony, who subsequently became a civil servant in London working for Oliver Cromwell, and was one of the men whom Oliver Cromwell sent in the 1650s to the Caribbean to take part in the Western design, which was the English conquest of Jamaica. So here you have a Plymouth colonist, Edward Winslow, who's also one of the principal architects of the conquest of Jamaica. And Jamaica, of course, became the wealthiest, the most prosperous, and the absolutely key component of the English slave economy in the West Indies.
Well, and I think that brings us to our final question. And could you elaborate on your title, Making Haste from Babylon?
Yeah, that's a quotation. What it is, it's a quotation that I came across. This actually dates from, I think, 1629. What happened was that at that period, when Puritans were beginning to conceive of what is known as the Great Migration, in other words, the great movement of English Puritans from England to Boston, Massachusetts, with the foundation of Boston. One of the things they were very worried about was the fact that the government of Charles I, in their view, was becoming increasingly oppressive. It was pushing England, they thought, in a Roman Catholic direction. Charles I's government of the church was something that Puritans found really very uncomfortable indeed. And the phrase "making haste from Babylon" comes from an English Puritan writing, I think he was writing to John Winthrop, who became the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company in 1630. He writes to John Winthrop and says that it's time to make haste out of Babylon. In other words, by Babylon, he meant the English environment, the England of Charles I, which he thought was becoming increasingly unchristian, increasingly tainted by corruption, increasingly tainted by what he thought of as being the evil effects of Catholicism and so forth. So that's what he meant. And when I saw this phrase, "make haste out of Babylon," which I thought was a very striking and evocative phrase, it occurred to me to make a good title for the book, because it's, and to be perfectly honest, all the other titles had been taken. You know, Mayflower, Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony, everybody had taken all the other titles. So I had to opt for something that was quite striking and unusual.
Well, thank you. As we come to the end of this session, thank you very much for your time with us and for your work on the book. I'm sure you've sparked interest in the book, which we have a direct link to Amazon on our website. So www.ccs/Mayflower, where you come for this conference. Go get the book.
Good, thank you.
So with that, we thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Do enjoy your time in that beautiful country, and we look forward to reading more from you.
Good, thank you very much indeed.